So welcome. My name's Gavin Bannerman. I'm the Director of Queensland Memory at the State Library of Queensland. And on behalf of my colleagues, I'd like to welcome you to the State Library of Queensland for the first of our Research Reveals event, which is a series that we'll be running over the next month. This is the very first Research Reveals event. There's one following this next week with Peter Rowenfeld talking about the Albert Hall and the history of that and Queensland's music history. We will be filming a component of this evening, the talks and the presentation, but not the collection displays upstairs. And the video will be available for public viewing in the coming weeks. So if somebody you know was unable to make it, our camera operator up there will be doing a great job to capture all the action, so you can share that. And also if you want to revisit and go back over things, there'll be a full recording of Hilary's presentation. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay respects to their ancestors who came before them. This location at Queensland Point has been a traditional meeting, sharing and gathering place for Aboriginal people, and I just want to acknowledge that we continue that tradition here today at State Library. I'd also like to acknowledge some of the special people who are here tonight. Tonight's speaker, Dr. Hilary Davies, the Queensland Business Leaders Hall of Fame Fellowship recipient for 2018, founding partners and sponsors of the Queensland Business Leaders Hall of Fame. Helen Brodie, who I don't think has been able to make it yet, but she is the president of our Queensland Library Foundation, members of the Queensland Library Foundation Council and Queensland Business Leaders Hall of Fame Governing Committee. So I saw Helen Gregory, thank you for coming, and others. Also donors and supporters of the State Library of Queensland and the Queensland Library Foundation. Thank you very much for your support in making things like tonight possible. I'd also, I haven't seen, is Rutian here tonight? No. Oh, Rutian, how you going? So has anyone who has been a fellow or is a fellow, do you want to just put up your hands? Yeah, two. Yeah, so we do like to encourage that cohort and the graduates of our fellowship program, and once a fellow, always a fellow at State Library. So we really welcome those fellows past and present. So tonight we focus on the 2018 Queensland Business Leaders Hall of Fame fellow Dr. Hilary Davies and her research into the Canada Cycle and Motor Agency Limited Queensland. Now apologies, after that, it's the first time you're going to hear that said all the way through. I will give the acronym of CCMA after that, so that's the first and last time you're going to hear that one from me, which was a leading company in Queensland's cycling and early motor industry between 1905 and 1930. Hilary's project has endeavoured to spotlight CCMA's influence on Queensland's business landscape. Through her investigations, Hilary has contributed new knowledge about Queensland's early motoring industry. Hilary began her interest in CCMA when she was inquiring about the early taxi industry. She learnt that CCMA started the first motorised taxi business in Queensland, and she wondered, what is this Queensland business with such a foreign name? Personally, I'm very fascinated with Hilary's research. It continues something which I've had a personal interest in. I've run events with about vintage bicycles, and people have been, very interested in the manufacture of bicycles in Queensland. I've done a few sort of investigations in the history of Jack Pesch and Tom Wallace and all these sorts of things, and I see this kind of crossover between people who are really into bikes and people into cars, and the issues of restoring and finding more about and tracing the provenance and all that sort of thing. So just seeing from the enthusiasm sort of outside, I'm getting that feeling that there is an enthusiasm about Queensland's history of car making. I'm also just want to give a quick plug to our fellowship program as well. Every year we run a fellowship program which gives opportunities for people to do their research projects with the support of State Library. We generally put a call out for applications for that in early in the year, just in late January. So just keep an eye out. In early 2020, we'll have a call for the Queensland Memory Awards for our fellowships and awards. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Hilary to the stage, and I'd like to thank again our our sponsors and supporters in making this possible. Thanks.
Thank you, Gavin. Good evening, everyone. Queenslanders on Road, the Canada Cycle and Motor Agency, Queensland Limited. Okay, the importance of the motor industry in Queensland history is hard to question. Before 1900, there were no automobiles in Queensland, but car ownership and motorised transport was adopted rapidly in the decades before the Second World War and achieved widespread popularity afterwards. New types of employment, new ways of performing work, and new social activities were created by motorised transport, and new words entered the lexicon. The motor industry in Queensland in the early 20th century was an exciting, innovative and growing industry. One of the companies leading the way was the Canada Cycle and Motor Agency, often called the CCM. Established in 1905, the CCM quickly expanded from primarily selling bicycles and sporting equipment into motor vehicles and motorboats, marine and stationary engines, and later into electrical lighting systems and radios. With branches and agencies throughout Queensland and in Lismore, and approximately 200 employees by 1914, the CCM was a major Queensland company during the first 3 decades of the 20th century. The CCM evolved from the Canada Cycle and Motor Company, which had been established in Canada in 1899 from merging 5 bicycle companies. It opened branches in Australia, New Zealand and Britain by about 1900. In Queensland, it traded from the Queen Street, Brisbane, opposite the GPO, and was managed by well-known Brisbane cyclist Alexander Vaughan Dodwell. The Massey Harris cycles it sold were well regarded and purchased by many Queenslanders. In 1900, the company imported a motor tricycle, possibly the first motor vehicle into the state. By 1905, the Canada Cycle and Motor Company had sold its Australian branches. The Queensland branch was taken over by its manager Dodwell. He formed the Canada Cycle and Motor Agency Limited with a capital of £12,000. The company's other directors were the Honourable Thomas Murray Hall, MLC, and James Johnston. The business commenced with 25 employees. Queensland's Canada Cycle and Motor Agency should not be confused with 2 other companies of similar names operating in New South Wales and Victoria, which formed in a similar manner, nor with the Canada Cycle and Motor Company of Toronto, Canada. The CCM's history can be divided into 3 phases: its establishment period up to the start of World War I, during the war, and the post-World War I period. Soon after Dodwell took over the CCM, he began securing the Queensland agencies for a number of motor makes. Within a few months, the CCM had secured the agencies for the famous Dirac motor car, the de Dion, and the Griffin motor bicycle, all French makes, as well as the Russell motor car produced by the Canada Cycle and Motor Company in Canada. Other agencies followed, such as the British Clement Talbot and Humber, the Italian Fiat and the French Renault. Explaining the advantages of motor vehicles to businesses, community services and individuals became an important part of the CCM's marketing strategy. In June 1906, Dodwell travelled throughout North Queensland, including the Chillago copper fields, the Gulf ports and as far north as Thursday Island, assessing business opportunities. At the yearly meeting of the Hatton Vale Farmers Association in 1907, Dodwell provided information about the practicality of motor vehicles for cream cartage. Similar trips and information sessions occurred thereafter. By June 1906, the company had secured premises suitable for expanding its motor business to provide a garage for car repairs and accommodation. This was on the corner of Creek and Adelaide Street, opposite the fashionable Gresham Hotel. The property was fitted with electrical light, accommodation for a dozen large cars, and with all the appliances for their overhaul and repair. In mid-1907, the CCM purchased this large property fronting Adelaide and Creek Streets, and at this position, within about 200 metres of the GPO, was regarded as central. Here it established its car showroom, as shown. The CCM also established branches in Toowoomba, Charters Towers and Rockhampton, and enlisted agents in towns and districts throughout Queensland to sell its vehicle to the growing number of people embracing motorisation. As well as its showrooms in Brisbane and throughout the state, the CCM sought other display opportunities. Beginning in 1906, the company usually hired a stand at the Brisbane exhibition. At the 1907 exhibition, the CCM and the Queensland Motor Importing Company of Toowoomba were the largest exhibitors, showing Russell, Humber and Talbot cars. A motorboat displayed by the CCM caused much admiration. The company also exhibited its vehicles and motors at regional shows. Another form of advertising used was performing and promoting feats of endurance, power and speed by the vehicles it sold, and many newspaper articles from the era about these achievements sound like CCM media releases. One example was the feat in 1908 of driving a pony durack up Townsville's precipitous Castle Hill, which then had no road or track to the top. Advertising in motor magazines such as The Australian Motorist from 1906 and The Steering Wheel from 1915, as well as in newspapers, was a regular means of reaching potential customers. Competitions were also used. In 1908, the CCM gave away a Durack car to a lucky winner who had purchased one of its bicycles. Starting in 1912, the CCM began promoting its products through screening promotional material. In this instance, a film about the American Studebaker Corporation's automobile factory showing car manufacture. Queensland's socio-economic elite took to the road for work and pleasure in this period. Buyers needed to be able to afford the £350 plus price tag for a car. Doctors were early converts to automobile transport, such as Queensland's first female doctor, Lillian Cooper, and Dr. Eleanor Greenham. Walter Pike, prominent local businessman and co-founder of Pike Brothers fashion store for gentlemen in Queen Street, and Brisbane dentist Thomas J. Copeland took delivery of Russell cars in 1906 and 07. Country sales were also forthcoming. James Clark, the well-known pearl fisher, purchased a Durack in late 1906. Pastoral property managers and owners and the Charters Towers mine owners also purchased cars. The CCM's range of motorcycles included the British Triumph and BSA. Later, the USA's Indian motorcycle and the Humber, Bradbury, Motor Reeve and 20th century motorcycles were added to the list. These vehicles were snapped up by those wanting less expensive motorised transport, shearers travelling between pastoral stations, overlanders and tourists, and by young men and women with a love of speed. The CCM's expansion was furthered in 1908 by its takeover of the Queensland Motor Importing Company, which held the Talbot, Singer and Stark motor agencies for Queensland. At this time, the Talbot car was regarded as Australia's leading motor car. In 1908, the CCM needed more capital to keep up with the rapid expansion of the motor trade and to establish a marine engine branch. To supply this, the company reformed as the Canada Cycle and Motor Agency Queensland Limited with a capital of £55,000. The CCM also expanded into other fields of motorised business. In May 1909, it established in Brisbane Queensland's first motorised taxi service, the Taxi Cab Company Limited, which used 6 imported Renault cars fitted with taximeters and driven by uniformed drivers. Later the same year, the CCM also established a taxi business in Toowoomba. The Queensland Country Life newspaper commented in the following year that these taxi services had become a necessity among Brisbane and Toowoomba's commercial and fashionable city life. In 1910, the CCM completed the first taxi cab bodies built in Brisbane. These were of the Lord-elect type and were built for Henry Taylor of Rockhampton. By June 1911, Taylor was running 3 cabs in Rockhampton, and the CCM had also delivered a cab to T.H. Allen of Mount Morgan. Around this time, the CCM also supplied the taxi for the first independent cabman in Brisbane, J.C. Pullen. Another phase in the uptake of motorisation was for commercial and community purposes. The CCM sold chassis with custom-built bodies for ambulances, buses and fire trucks. It supplied a motorised ambulance to the Brisbane Ambulance Brigade in 1909. An Albion motor truck was supplied to the Milton Volunteer Fire Brigade in 1910 and immediately proved its worth. Other service vehicles followed. to the Ipswich Ambulance Brigade, shown here, the Ipswich Fire Brigade, and the Queensland and Charters Towers Fire Brigade. By 1908, the CCM was selling commercial vehicles by importing Albion chassis suitable for heavy cartage up to 7 tonnes and supplying custom-built bodies for them. In October 1910, the CCM supplied a lorry with a custom body constructed at the Austral Carriage Works to Adam Henderson of Rockhampton. By December that year, the CCM had supplied to CE Woods an Albion motorbus to convey 23 passengers from South Brisbane Station to Campbell Street, Bowen Hills. Queensland Country Life newspaper deemed this service a wonderful success. The company also supplied the 30-seater comma bus seen here, used by Mr Kanan for the first motorised bus service between New Farm and North Quay in 1911. The body was constructed and fitted in the CCM's Fortitude Valley workshop. Sales of trucks in the Longreach district took place after vehicle demonstration there in 1911. A different type of commercial vehicle sold by the company at this time was the mighty Atom auto carrier, which was advertised in 1911 as the first auto carrier imported into Queensland and suitable for butchers, bakers, drapers and allied trades. Well-known Brisbane department store Finney Isles purchased one of these vehicles for its deliveries. The CCM's growth in the lead up to World War I was rapid, and to accommodate this, the company constructed a 3-storey building designed by architect Richard Gailey for the site on the corner of Adelaide and Creek Streets. In late 1910, the CCM moved into its building, registering it as the company's office. There, Renault, Talbot, Standard, BSA, Humber, Studebaker and Russell cars were displayed and repairs were conducted on site. The CCM's other Brisbane premises reflected the differing aspects of its business. At 280 Queen Street was the sports department, where bicycles and a diverse range of sporting equipment were sold. The CCM, over its whole lifetime, maintained its involvement in cycling by sponsoring races and awards. In 1909, the CCM leased land at Newstead Terrace, Newstead, and opened a marine motor department, which built, repaired and hired out motorboats, as well as providing boat mooring and storage. I can't give you the exact location, but if anyone knows, I'd love to hear. These premises closed by October 1916. The company's Fortitude Valley workshop, shown on the left, and you've seen other photos outside today, made customised bodies for CCM imported chassis and operated from about 1911 until the company's closure. In this early phase of operation, up to the commencement of World War I, the CCM achieved remarkable growth, as did the motor industry in general, with around 3,000 cars and 2,000 motorcycles in Queensland in 1914. In May 1913, the Brisbane Courier newspaper could say, "During the last 10 years, no business perhaps has made greater progress than the CCM, the sales of the company today being 600% greater than they were 6 or 7 years ago." And when CCM staff farewelled Dodwell on a world trip in March 1914, 200 staff assembled to do so. Over its lifetime, the CCM was in competition with other motor sales companies. In 1906, the CCM and J. Howard & Co. were the biggest firms in the motor industry in Brisbane. By the time the Motor Traders Association formed in March 1916, the principal firms in Queensland, as well as the CCM, were W.M. Trevethan, Evers Brothers, E.G. Eager & Son, Howard Motor Company, Dalgety & Co., A.J. Lever & Co., Queensland Motor Agency and Stedman and Mackay. The First World War, commencing in August 1914, brought to the economy inflation, higher costs and higher wages due to manpower shortages. It had an immediate and lasting effect on the CCM. About 50% of its workforce volunteered for service, including managers, salesmen and workmen. Throughout the war, the CCM supported the war effort. Within weeks of the outbreak of hostilities, the company had donated to the Australian Forces a Renault car with a customised CCM body to carry a machine gun and its crew. You can see on the left. This machine gun carrier was presented to the 2nd Light Horse Regiment at Enoggera in September 1914. Later, with other Studebaker dealers in Australia, the CCM donated a 6-cylinder Studebaker to the Australian Mining Corps for their use in France. The CCM also lent equipment, such as a stationary engine to the grenade school at the inaugural rifle range for the duration of hostilities, cars to the Red Cross for transporting convalescent soldiers, and a truck to assist with the erection of an Anzac cottage at Inoggera for a soldier's widow. In the spirit of wartime charity, the CCM and its employees donated to a variety of causes, including the Motor Ambulance Fund and the Franco-Queensland League of Help. The company also participated in efforts to support returned soldiers, such as Wattle Day in June 1918, the purpose of which was to foster national sentiment and raise funds for the establishment of an orthopaedic hospital to treat maimed soldiers. At its premises, the CCM created an exceptionally fine display of wattle, and Mrs. Dodwell, shown here, received first prize in the decorated car competition. With British and European motor vehicle supplies cut off by war production, the CCM imported American vehicles. From 1915, its agencies included the American Republic trucks and Indian motorcycles. However, US vehicle availability was also affected by wartime production as US manufacturers supplied Allied forces. The CCM participated in peace celebrations held in Brisbane in November 1918 and July 1919, when soldiers, nurses and floats created by various Brisbane organisations paraded through Brisbane CBD. The CCM's Pipe of Peace float in the July 1919 Peace Parade, shown here, simultaneously celebrated peace and promoted Indian motorcycles. After the business slowdown caused by World War I, the CCM sought to resume its rapid pre-war growth while supporting peacetime recovery efforts. To take advantage of the resumption of peacetime conditions, to grow its business, re-employ its former staff and add new agencies, the CCM increased its nominal capital to £208,000 in 1919. The company welcomed about 50 returning soldiers back to their former positions or similar ones, and continued to extend assistance to those who had been affected by the war. It donated goods and money to causes as Queenslanders sought to support returned soldiers, improve conditions in post-war Europe, and memorialise those who had died. Post-war, the CCM added to its vehicle agencies the American-built Rio Speedwagon commercial vehicle, Dodge cars sold between 1920 and 23, and grey vehicles, as well as British-built Austin trucks, tractors and Clino cars. Later, the Lynn tractor was added to its stable of vehicles. From 1922, the CCM operated a used car department in their Brisbane premises to tap into this growing market. The company also began selling completely new products, the Hilary electric light and power plant from about 1919, and radios from about 1925. It launched a new radio department selling Operadio brand radios, which it demonstrated through the state by receiving Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne radio broadcasts. Between 1922 and 1928, Queensland experienced its first and only economic boom between the outbreak of war in 1914 and the 1950s. The benefits of the boom economy were experienced throughout the state. Queenslanders embraced motorisation with enthusiasm. In the 1923 to 24 financial year, the state recorded the third highest number of vehicle registrations in Australia, and Australia had the fifth highest vehicle registrations in the world, behind the USA, United Kingdom, Canada and France. During this period of growth, the CCM paid dividends of up to 10%. In Brisbane, where 29% of the population resided, this boom resulted in a flurry of building activity which transformed Brisbane's CBD. The CCM took part in this when, to accommodate its business expansion, it extended its headquarters by adding 3 stories in 1925. This addition had been designed by architect Richard Gailey at the time of the first 3 stories planning. In its final form, the building contained offices, car showrooms, sales areas for its many departments, a garage for repair and maintenance work, and a cinema that accommodated 200 people. Expansion was still the company's plan when in April 1927 the CCM announced it would open another branch in Townsville to better serve their northern clients. It contracted the well-known business of Leon's Motor and Cycle Works Limited for this purpose. However, later that year, for the first time, the company reported a net trading loss for the year ending 30 April 1927. This, the CCM reported, was due to a lack of inexpensive cars to sell, drought, keen competition, illness of directors, and new trading conditions that were affecting the motor industry. In October 1928, the CCM petitioned for the liquidation of Leon's Motor and Cycle Works Limited in Townsville, which was indebted to the CCM for over £20,000 for interest, goods supplied, and work done for the company. A series of financial and business issues followed in 1929. In March, the CCM closed its Rockhampton branch. In August, the company disclosed a debt of £86,491, including £11,500 brought forward from 30 April 1928, and Dodwell resigned as managing director, although remained as a company director. In October, the company applied for a reduction of its capital in the Supreme Court. But on 1 November 1929, after more than 2 decades of growth and leadership in the motor industry, the CCM succumbed to the worsening economic conditions and entered voluntary liquidation, becoming an early casualty of the Great Depression that continued throughout most of the 1930s. During the liquidation process, various sections of the CCM business were sold, some to former employees, or continued through subagents. Dodwell established Champion Automobiles and took over the Studebaker agency. Selling off the company's assets took time. Its Fortitude Valley premises were sold sometime after September 1930. The CCM building was finally purchased by the Primary Producers Association in 1934 for about £30,000, having been passed in 1930 for £33,000, well below its 1925 valuation of over £43,000. During World War II, this building was requisitioned for war purposes and used as the American Army's postal exchange. It became the focal point for the infamous Battle of Brisbane on 26 and 27 November 1942. But today, the most tangible reminder of the presence and impact of the CCM, a major company in Queensland's early motoring history, is the former CCM building, which is a locally listed heritage place. Although the CCM succumbed to financial difficulties, probably caused by its rapid expansion in the post-war period, combined with worsening economic conditions, there can be no denying that while it traded, the CCM played an important role in putting Queenslanders on the road. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the supporters of the Business Leaders Hall of Fame Fellowship, Queensland Library Foundation, State Library of Queensland and QUT Business School, and staff of the State Library of Queensland have been generous with their time, and also to thank community members who have provided valuable information and assistance to me in the course of this research. Thank you. And I believe we're going to have questions now, so I'm ready for that.
Thanks very much, Hilary. That's it's fascinating, and I must say, like, you see a fellow coming in, working, but it's so great to see actually, there's nothing beats seeing the pictures up on the screen. You're like, oh yeah, that stuff that, we have in the collection.
Yeah.
It's an amazing thing. What was the most exciting thing to discover in your research?
I think it was that the CCM and its staff were involved in so many diverse activities. And how well they were able to advertise. I mean, they must have been putting out press releases every week. There was so much advertising and so many articles about them. There's amazing photographs in the collection that were really wonderful to find. And the motoring magazines in the State Library collection have a wealth of information, not just about the CCM, but also about a diverse range of motoring activities that's gobsmacking. You know, the women on motorcycles in the 1910s and things like that. They're really exciting things to find out.
And I mean, you talked about the value of CCM and how that ebbed and flowed. How many employees? Like, how big an organisation?
Well, they had 200 employees
Yep.
by 1914, and I think they got back to that level after the war. Just doing the rough figures, there's nothing definite. It looks like they might have lost half of the people. That 50% went to war and only 50 came back. Bearing in mind some might not have wanted to be re-employed there, it's still a pretty big number that didn't return. But I think that its size definitely would have got back to that 200 people, that they were able to fill the double size building that they built in 1925.
You talk a little bit about the managing director, and you know, often narratives about businesses now are all about the vision of the CEO, or you know, this you know, sort of entrepreneurial figure, or this visionary, you know, moved the business in this direction. Was the direction of CCM driven by a particular character, or was it strongly influenced by one particular person, or was it a range of a collective?
It's not really easy to say that, who it was, but I do feel that it must have been, if not the managing director, then him and the two other directors that were, they seem to be really keen to capture whatever new way they could go to improve, make their business bigger, you know, make the most of opportunities. At one point, they were talking about going into aviation in the about 1920s. That's pretty big sort of vision. Like, let's do all of these things, and now we'll go into aviation. I thought, what? But they didn't. So perhaps as well, yeah.
And what's one thing that they could have? Like, why did they fail? What was their single biggest mistake?
I can't say anything definite, but I get the feeling that they probably overextended. There was a boom economy in the first part of the 1920s. They expanded, they built that new building. They must have had debt from that. And I think the downturn and the changed competition as well. I get the feeling that in the 1920s there were a lot more people operating in the motor trade as competition, and that they perhaps just overextended, and it came back in big debt that they couldn't resolve because the trading conditions were going backwards.
And I found it fascinating that they had a cinema in that the premises. Do you know what they were screening in the cinema?
There were several different motorcar related films and events that they had there. My favourite event they had was a fashion show in conjunction with Finney Isles, and that they drove the cars up into the building and had the models parading around. It was extraordinary what they were up to. Yeah.
Do you get that sense in a very workplace health and safety world now that you could just do stuff that, you know?
Probably, yeah. They just did it.
How did they drive up?
Oh, they would have had a ramp of some sort. They would
sorry,
have
in
had
Townsville,
ramp.
up Castle Hill.
How'd they get up Castle Hill?
Yeah.
I have no idea. Have you been up there?
Yeah, I've not been up there.
But I went up there by road just a few weeks ago, and I have no idea how they got up there without a road. I mean, it's, you know, you could go round the lower part, but it's pretty steep at the top. Yeah.
Well, we've got two microphones here, and I know there will be people who have some specific questions for Hilary.
You asked about the location of
of their motorboat building.
To me, it looks like it's immediately upstream of Breakfast Creek, and also, what do they call that park there? Newstead Park.
Well, yeah.
And where the Historical Society is.
That's right. It's in Newstead Terrace, but there were a number of sites in that area that I circled that it could have been. So I'm not exactly sure whereabouts on Newstead Terrace the building and the works were. Yeah.
Brett Hampson from the Studebaker Car Club of Queensland. I'm just wondering, have you got any idea of the volume of vehicles they sold over the time?
Good question. No, I don't. I'd say a lot, because they like most motor companies, they had a lot of agencies when they started out. I guess it might be possible to determine if you could go through the advertising with the number of cars that they say they're landing. There's a lot of ads. I found something like 6,000 ads in Trove for CCM. So you could methodically go through their advertising over the period of their life and get an idea, probably a lower end, because perhaps they wouldn't all be advertised as being, this many cars landed that they were doing early on. So I don't have an answer. And unfortunately, we don't have the day-to-day records of the company. They, I presume, went to the liquidator and would have been dealt with by that process. Yeah.
What was your favourite car they sold?
My favourite car? Let me think. I think the little baby Austin, there's a gorgeous photo in front of the old government house. Some, young blade, university going, getting into his baby Austin. That's fantastic.
If we want to access,
Yep.
if we want to access photos from the company sold the vehicles, how do we actually do that search through the State Library?
We have, so through Hilary's presentation, she's cited sometimes the unique identifier, so you can search for that. We've also working with our researchers where they produce a bibliography, so there'll be some resources and that sort of thing. But also, if you just, do you want to just, what's the secret to unlocking the catalogue?
Well, a lot of the images for these cars are available through the catalogue because they're as digital images. So if you've seen one in the presentation, it's probably a digital image that you'd be able to find by accessing the catalogue. Other images that I've shown here come from motoring magazines. And so you could access that magazine most probably through request through level 3 or 4.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You can just do a basic keyword search and type it in, and I know we're working to there's some photographs where it's a photograph of the CCMA building and it's just not attributed as being that building. So if you do have that information as well, we can add that to the record so that anybody just doing that basic search will retrieve that in their results.
That's right. And a lot of the images I found are also on the Flickr page that ended up.
That's right.
I think it had 60 or 70 images, so that's probably worth looking at.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you know how the agencies worked. Were they privately owned? Did they have to buy the cars and the bikes?
Okay, yes, they would be individual businesses in the towns and cities throughout Queensland, and so they made the order through the CCM because the CCM held the Queensland agency for the sale of those particular vehicles. So any orders were made through the CCM when they had a customer that wanted a car. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I sort of wondered what it looked like. Were they did they have garages attached?
Oh, they could have, yes.
Was there a general sort of look to an agency?
I can't tell you whether there's they all had the same features. Some were still selling bicycles as well as motor cars. Others were garages and and mainly selling motor vehicles. For instance, like Elvery's in Toowoomba, they had a garage, they had the Studebaker, they were selling Studebakers, and they also were operating the taxi in Toowoomba that Mr. Elvery and another business partner purchased from the CCM quite early on in that 1911 period, something like that.
Mr. Blake?
Hilary, it seems to me that in Queensland history, the history of the motor vehicle has sort of been neglected in a sense, and it seems to me what you're doing is really highlighting actually much more significant than we've tended to sort of acknowledge. So I guess there's a lot more. In terms of the numbers, I mean, I think there's an absolutely fascinating document, the list of cars that were registered in 1923. There's about 12,000. The list's got 12,000, and it lists all the owners, occupations, where they lived, and the vehicle type. I'm in the process of analysing it a bit, but so the information is actually there. You know, we can work out in 1923 how many Studebakers there were in Queensland, in Brisbane. So I mean, I think it raises some interesting questions and much more further research about its influence.
Oh, absolutely, Tom. I think I've just barely scratched the surface of the topic. And like you say, there's lists of people purchasing cars, and they're published in, I think, the Steering Wheel and places like that, such and such bought this car, and there's a lot of information. And so the information that you have, so that's how many thousand did you say in 1923?
It's about 12,000.
12,000, and yet in 1914 we have that statistic of 3,000 cars and 2,000 motorcycles. So we can see how quickly motorisation is taking place, and it didn't diminish at all. Throughout the 20s, there was still the rapid motorisation. Yeah, there's a lot more work to do. That's for sure.
Hi, Hilary. How are you?
Good, thank you.
Just a question, and this probably is a little bit later than where you've gone in this presentation tonight.
Yes.
But can you talk about very briefly the outcome of the court case?
Well, yes, I can, and I mean, I must say, I don't have any expertise in the outcome of the court case, except that my understanding was that the liquidators were pursuing the directors of the company, and that in the end, the shareholders called a halt to it, and there was a judgment by consent, which is that there was the charges were dropped and the claims were dropped, that there had been any financial impropriety was dropped. Yeah.
Can I just ask a question about safety, because it was the early days of motoring and things like that. Were there any sort of famous cases of crashes and how the public dealt with it and how the company dealt with it, given that it was sort of the early days of that sort of thing?
There are reports of accidents, yes. And I'm sorry, it's a good question, and I'm just trying to think through what any of the cases and what happened. They're reported in the newspaper, and but whether there was a case where a child was killed, and I believe the family took the taxi driver to court about it, but the outcome, I'm sorry, I just can't remember. So there were incidents like that. Accidents were happening, people were killed, and I think there was also a case where a driver of a CCM taxi was supposedly hit someone. I'm just sorry, it's something I haven't looked at for a little while. It just came up when I was looking at reports. So I can't give you a definitive answer, I'm sorry.
Just an interesting story on fatal car crashes. I'm very old, as you can tell. Was an ambulance paramedic for 48 years, and And one of my research topics was early accidents and the impacts that the discoveries out of those incidents occurred. But the first fatal road traffic crash in Brisbane was in fact in a motor vehicle driven by a doctor, which was really interesting given your earlier comments, because they were one of the few people who could afford a motor car. And there were two sisters running to catch a tram in Sandgate Road at Clayfield, and one sister tried to board the tram from the wrong side of the road and was cleaned up by the doctor, and she was severely injured. He threw her in the back of his car and took her to the hospital, but she subsequently died. But which is very sad, of course, but what was interesting about that was that two significant changes to the law occurred. And one was it became mandatory for a person to have a licence to drive a motor vehicle for the first time in Queensland. And the second one was that it became mandatory for motor vehicles to pass a tram on the left-hand side. So it's just... so there's quite a bit of interesting research there.
Yeah.
Hilary, can I just ask about your fellowship experience? Like, how many hours, or how much of your life did this consume? And I think you mentioned to me last night you've trawled through 3,000 newspapers, something amazing like that.
Yeah. Well, it's taken a lot of time, but some of you'll know I've been doing it part-time and working part-time. So I would say it's taken, hours every week to do to cover the newspaper articles and the magazines and so on. But it's been a great experience. I think it's an amazing experience to have the opportunity to find out about an interesting period in time and an interesting industry, and have the focus of looking at one company to do that, and opening up that whole area was a great experience that I certainly wouldn't not have done. And I'm sure if anyone else is considering doing a project, that you'd have just as much enjoyment. It might take the time to do, but it's worth it when you're interested in what you're doing.
Brett Hampson again from the Studebaker Car Club. Oh, I notice there's a lot of veteran and vintage type car club owners in the audience this evening. How many people in the audience can trace a car back to the CCM? Excellent. Yeah. That's good. We just had our national rally up at Toowoomba, which had a car there in particular, and the Bennett family are here this evening, and they've got the information out the front if anyone wants to have a look at it.
Hello, Julie Cosgrove from the Studebaker Car Club of Queensland as well. Thank you, Hilary, for your research. I'm particularly interested in the CCM building,
Yes.
and wondered whether you're aware of whether it's heritage protected and whether there are any remaining features that have been preserved to give a nod to the particular history of that building.
It is still there, and it does have local heritage listing with the Brisbane City Council. I can't tell you what is left in the building because I haven't been in it, which would be lovely to do. It was jigged when the primary producers went in there. I know they made changes in 1934, and what the changes that have been subsequently carried out, I don't know. And there's nothing I've seen in the Brisbane City Council entry that gives me any indication of what has happened in that building. So we could see in the 1940s image where they were doing those repairs, the awning there at the street, but that awning is now being changed. So and we know that's happened.
Thank you.
Hi, it's Keith Collins from the Veteran Car Club. You've mentioned taxi cabs a few times. I was just wondering if you have any breakdown on the manufacturer's name of those cabs?
There was Renault cars with CCM bodies for those first ones, as far as I'm aware, from 1909, and then they were building other cabs for businesses in Rockhampton, Mount Morgan, the ones in Toowoomba as well. That's the only information I have. What they might have done later, I'm not aware of. They're the only ones I've tracked down.
I mean, it's obviously an interest. I mean, it's a broader topic, but the place that cars play in our lives, and I think that is a highly motivating thing. A lot of people here, you know, that it's cars play a central role in a lot of our lives, and the nature of it, the role that it plays, is different now than it was, you know, in the days of CCM, and it was different in the 50s, different in the 80s. But did you want to talk a little bit about the role that cars play in people's lives and some of the responses you've got from that?
Oh, well, cars are fundamental to our lives now, and for the CCM, it was making their uses relevant, you know, and educating people how they could use motorisation, whether it was for their leisure or whether it was for their business purposes. That was their goal in that very early phase, and probably the whole of their phase of existence. Whereas that's not their role of motor car sales companies anymore. They would have a different take on what they're selling. They're selling, you know, the glamour of the Mercedes-Benz or you know, the reliability or those different things. At the same time, reliability was a very important thing.
It seems like, I mean,
in CCM times
a lot
too.
of motoring now is like, I just want to get from A to B, and a vehicle is just a means to get there. But it seemed like motoring was more fun back then.
It was quite glamorous, wasn't it? You know, it looked glamorous, but you know, was it? You know, those heavy gearboxes. There's no autos, you know, power steering in those days, and so it was a different experience. It was probably was a big adventure and an exciting thing to be doing, and a brave new world of activities, and the ACQ, as it was until after the war, was part of that. And Dodwell, for instance, was an early member of that organisation, and I think a committee member as well. And so they were off having these glamorous events, and they'd do speed trials, and they'd do all sorts of a gymkhana. That's right, they had gymkhanas, and someone said to me, "What on earth is that?" And I thought, well, I presume it's like you know, a horse gymkhana, except you're doing it with cars and going around bollards or something like that. I don't know. Maybe someone can tell me the answer.
The car clubs do that now, don't they?
There you go. Well,
Just a question.
I'd just like to pass on that anybody who owns a veteran Studebaker or Studebakers up to about 1921, Bill Dowd was an assembler at Studebaker and later became foreman assembler, and he filed a mark on the back of the cylinder block near the firewall for all Studebakers that he assembled for CCMA. And later on, he was pretty much known as a mechanic, and people would get him to attend to their Studebaker, and he could always check if he knew his cars from that mark. So if people have one and they find a mark around the back of the block, then they know that it was sold and assembled by CCMA.
There's lots of marks on my block.
Just lady down the front.
Thanks, Ed. I'm Lynn Bennett. I'm the owner of the 1923 Studebaker my husband's restored, which is out the front that you've seen. But also going to say, not all things were glamorous. One of the exciting things that we found out through looking through the history of our car, excuse me, was it was actually used. they were ute as well. So the CCN actually made them to become a ute, so they were very versatile. Now, our car was actually out on a property, and it actually had dynamite in the back and the plunger in the front, so they could actually remove the tree stumps on their property. So not everything was really glamorous. I just wanted to, make sure it was putting all its warts and everything in there. Thank you.
That's a word that should be added to the dictionary, uted. I like that.
Presumably the rapid growth of the car industry put pressure on the construction of roads, and did you come across any evidence that the car companies were actually active in advocating development of roads?
Absolutely, they were.
As individual companies or as a group of car selling companies, or did they leave it to the RACQ or early?
Well, you can see it in the motoring magazines that they're advocating for better roads. The individual motor car companies would individually as well, but the Motor Traders Association from 1916 is formed, and I'm sure they were as also, but I don't have a particular, reference that I could say. But I know that in the motoring magazines, there's definitely calls for better roads, and they were met in the 1920s with the formation of the Main Roads Commission, and then became the Main Roads Department. They did get their way, and formation of better roads like the Anzac Memorial Avenue also came through that community push for a better road, and that was a memorialisation as well.
Okay, so.
In your research.
Sorry.
Are there any statistics on these old veteran cars, whether they were brought in complete from America or wherever and just, off the wharf or in a box, or were they brought in knockdown form, or were they brought in in partial form, and then the Australians, buffed up the rest of it? Are there any stats on how complete these cars were and were they absolutely fully imported?
I think we might have some answers in the crowd.
Yeah. I don't have the answer to that amazing question. I can't tell you because I haven't really looked into it. I'm sorry. But someone else may know the answer to that. I mean, they were importing chassis and then doing the bodies themselves. But statistics about how many, I don't know. It may well be statistics in the motoring magazines, but I wasn't looking.
We got a direct answer,
I'm afraid.
I have an original photo inside their assembly works in a corner of Creek and Adelaide, showing the Studebaker crates and the vehicles being assembled there. So, it appears that they were assembling, quite a number.
Thanks.
Good, thank you.
In your research, did you find out if, given that Brisbane is a lot closer to northern New South Wales than Sydney is,
yes,
were they exporting, for a better word, anything to northern New South Wales?
Yes, they were, because they had an agent, a branch in Lismore. So northern New South Wales was definitely part of their stamping ground where they were selling into. Yeah.
Probably down to the final questions. Yep. So,
Matt Burke, Griffith University. Great presentation. Sorry I missed the very start of it. Apologies. I have a number of students who often come to me and say, where do I look for the transport history of Brisbane? And we don't have a great consolidated, commissioned history of Brisbane yet, really. And it's been a long time since Carroll's book Shaping a City came out too, in terms of the history of this city. There's a need for updating the histories of Brisbane for our students. And that's my view, and I just wonder whether you share that view in any way, or you think we need to continue to add to this transport history, because we've got a lot of naive young folks out there who are desperate to learn.
Okay. Well, I can't put my finger on, like you say, just, you know, where to go for one you know, catch-all history. That's right. Exactly. It would require quite a bit of work to pull together, you know, the main roads annual reports and all those other things from that primary source, plus the motoring magazines, and in the history where there are, you know, records of the council records as well that cover the road creation. So there's a huge amount of work to do to pull all of that together, and no, it hasn't been done.
It needs to be a commissioned history.
Well, you commission it and I'll do it.
Maybe we should talk to Neil at CMA.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Sounds like something.
Yeah,
next
sounds
step.
like
Sorry.
sounds like a new job.
Yep. Last question. I should also say we'll be up for about an hour up in level 4, so there'll be plenty of time to pepper questions.
Yes.
I'm Mark Bennett, the owner of the Studebaker, you know. Well done, Hilary.
Thank
Very
you,
well
Mark.
done. And I just wanted to answer the questions about the containers, and I can talk relatively to my car. My car came in from Canada as a flat pack. So it was the chassis, and then it was built in Queensland Silky Oak at Canadian Cycle Motor Company in Brisbane. So it was all Queensland Silky Oak, and I must admit some Oregon that was in the floor as well, which stands to reason, a bit like the Model Ts, that they use the packing crates. And funny enough, there was a lady that came in, I'm not sure where up the back. I think it was her grandfather, used to drag the Studebaker boxes from the wharves on bullock tray to the Studebaker Canadian Cycle Motor Company, and then he would help himself, I think, to the Oregon boxes and made a house out of what was left. So all of this, so as much as I know there is a fully imported 23, I know more about 23 Studebakers. Down at the Inverell Museum is a fully imported, which is mainly steel inside. So inside of it, so they class that was an extra £25 to buy. So you were upmarket there. But ours being the Colonial, being Silky Oak, Queensland and Canadian Cycle Motor Company, is the only one that we know of, and I'd be quite happy if someone would come and tell me that we've got one in their backyard because I'd love to look at it to make sure it's exactly right. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I think that's a pretty good note to end on. I'd just like to thank Hilary again.
Thank you.
And I'd like to thank QUT Business School and the Queensland Library Foundation for making this possible, and all of our supporters, donors. Please keep in touch through the usual channels. Research Reveals continues next week with Peter Rowenfeld, and also keep an eye out for the call for applications. If you want to do your own research, you might want to do the next chapter of Brisbane's transport history. Early 2020, we'll put the call out. So thank you again.